There are moments in life that force us to stop and ask ourselves, is our heart still brave enough to accept something new? Eliza Carter, a woman whose heart seemed to have closed after years of loneliness, unexpectedly meets a cowboy much younger than herself, a man who gives her a strangely familiar feeling, but also brings along her deepest fear, his love in old age, still allowed. As the town begins to gossip, and age becomes an invisible string that ties her steps, Eliza is faced with a seemingly impossible choice: protect the small peace she has worked so hard to regain, or open her heart once more, even if the price may be hurt. If it were you, would you dare to step through the eyes of the world to hold on to the person who makes your heart beat differently? Is there something in your life you've longed for but been afraid to touch because you thought you were too old? Please join me on this gentle yet profound journey. Like, share, and subscribe to the channel to prepare for moments that touch your heart. Snow began falling on Cotton Ridge on a pale afternoon in late December. The first flakes of the season fell slowly, as light as a breath of air, covering the ground with nearly 8 inches in just a few hours. Winds from the Wind River Mountains blew through the small town, carrying a chill so sharp that anyone standing outside for too long would find their hands numb. Cotton Ridge had been quiet, but that afternoon the silence was broken by a long, rasping whistle, sharp as a knife blade sliding across metal. The train from the south was pulling into the station, but seconds later, there was a deafening crash. A freight car derailed, tipped over, and crashed into the snow. Screams, screeching metal, and the sound of wheels spinning out of control all echoed through the valley. The townspeople rushed to the train station. Men wrapped in thick coats and carried kerosene lamps. Women wrapped scarves around their necks, trying to keep warm in the bitter cold. Cotton Ridge had a population of just over 100, so when trouble struck, everyone knew everyone else. Among the bustling crowd, Eliza Carter appeared. She wore a warm blue wool coat, a gray felt hat, and her dark brown hair was tied back in a bun. At 41, Eliza had a quiet beauty, a calm, warm beauty, and something that made people want to come closer and talk. She was the only teacher in the town. During her 10 years as a widow, she had lived a peaceful and quiet life, enough to forget that her heart had ever been moved. Eliza ran towards the sound of a child crying. Beside the tilted train, a boy of about 8 years old was stuck between the wooden beam and the wall. Snow was falling on his hair. His lips were blue from the cold. Eliza knelt down and stroked the boy's hair, her voice gentle but firm. "It's okay. Son, I'm here." At that moment, a figure rushed up from behind. His heavy footsteps crunched through the thick snow. It was a tall young man, wearing a thick dark brown leather coat, a dark black Stetson hat, and rough leather gloves. Snow clung to his shoulders, but he paid it no mind. He looked at the scene before him, his face tense with worry. "Let me," he said in a low, husky voice with a Western accent. Eliza looked up and met his eyes. Ash-gray eyes, the kind that had seen more in life than his years would allow. There was no panic, just determination, calm, and a deep, nameless sadness. Luke Maddox. Eliza wouldn't learn that name until days later. But at that moment, all she knew was that this was a cowboy, a stranger, who had just arrived in town on the same train. Luke used all his strength to lift the wooden beam that was pressing down on the boy's leg. Eliza held the oil lamp closer, her hands trembling slightly from the cold and anxiety. However, his calmness spread to her like a rare warmth in this harsh winter. "Just a little more," Luke growled, the muscles in his arms tensing under his shirt. There was a small screech, and the wood sprang free. Eliza pulled the boy out, cradling him, checking him for serious injuries. Only when she was sure he was okay did she look up at the man who had saved him. "Thank you," she said, her voice low and sincere. Luke didn't answer. He just nodded, but his eyes followed the boy with genuine concern. When he turned away, Eliza noticed a large gash on his arm, blood seeping through his shirt. "You're hurt," she called after him. He paused, looked at the wound, then back at Eliza. "Just a scratch." But Eliza didn't believe it. She grabbed his wrist and pulled him closer to the light. "You think it's a scratch? Go over there. I have bandages." Instead of protesting, Luke just silently followed. Eliza led him into the train station waiting room, which was filled with panicking people. But when they saw Luke's calm composure and Eliza's composure, the atmosphere seemed to lighten a bit. Eliza sat him down on a wooden chair near the fireplace. Wind whistled through the narrow cracks in the door, and snow glittered outside the glass. She took a bandage from her coat pocket and carefully wiped the blood from his arm. The temperature in the room was warmer, but when her hand touched his skin, she felt something strange run down her spine. Not because of fear, but because she felt like she had known this presence for a long time. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice low as if afraid to break the silence that had fallen between them. He answered slowly, "Luke? Luke Maddox." "You're not from town?" she asked, though she already knew. "No, I'm just passing through. Looking for a place to stay for a few days." Eliza nodded. Her hands went to work, wrapping bandages around his wound with the deftness of someone who had worked with children for years. In the firelight, Luke's face took on a more defined look. Strong features, a slight stubble on his chin, the tired lines at the corners of his eyes, the look of someone who had spent too many sleepless nights. "Thank you," he said when she finished. "It's nothing. I just did what needed to be done." They were both silent for a moment. Only the sound of the wind blowing through the roof and the crackling of the fire in the stove could be heard. Then Luke said something that surprised Eliza. "You're so calm." Eliza paused. "I don't feel very calm. Trust me." He looked at her, his eyes suddenly softening. "In the midst of chaos, having someone like you is precious." Eliza didn't know how to respond. Part of her wanted to look away. Another part wanted to hold that gaze a little longer. Outside, the snow was still falling, but in that moment, amid the wind and the fire, something very small, very fragile, had just begun. When the situation calmed down, Luke stood up, put his Stetson back on, and said, "I owe you a favor." Eliza shook her head. "You don't owe anything." Luke looked at her for a few seconds longer than necessary. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Eliza with a strange feeling as if something had shifted slightly inside her. Not strong enough to name, but enough to make her stand still and watch until his figure disappeared into the falling snow. And that was the moment, though no one realized it immediately, that Eliza's life was about to take a different turn. Snow lay thick on the wooden roofs of Cotton Ridge for days after the accident. The town was still cold, but it had returned to its usual rhythm. Horses still hooved on the main street. The murmur of customers at Lucy's still rang out regularly. And church bells rang out every weekend with a never-ending tradition. Eliza Carter, however, felt that something had changed, though outwardly everything looked the same as it had every day for the past 10 years. She went to school, taught the children letters and arithmetic, prepared her lessons by lamplight, and then returned to the small wooden house behind the school. All seemed calm, but inside her there was a small movement, like the sound of melting snow in the weak sunlight, not easy to hear but very present to the sensitive. Eliza remembered the moment at the train station. Luke Maddox's ashen eyes, the way he stood in the midst of confusion with a strange calm, his wounded yet strong hands, and his words, so brief, but they left her with a feeling she couldn't describe, a rare warmth, like a small fire in a cold room. For some reason, that image had been stuck in her mind. Sometimes, as she was writing on the blackboard, she would find herself thinking about that look. She would shake her head, remind herself it was just a stranger, a cowboy passing by, a man more than a decade younger than her. She had built a wall around herself for too long. It was what kept her going for 10 years after her husband died in the mine collapse. A slow but deep pain, a quiet closing of her heart, not loud, not collapsing, but a restrained closing, like a door shut by a cold wind. But Luke's presence was like a different wind, not cold, but warm, not violent, but enough to make her confused. Eliza knew she must not let herself be swayed again, not with a stranger, not with someone younger, not with someone who had no reason to stay at Cotton Ridge. She reminded herself so many times, but emotions were still difficult to control. Luke Maddox showed up for the second time one day. Eliza was putting her books on the shelf when the classroom door opened. The cold wind from outside rushed in along with heavy, steady footsteps. Eliza turned around, and when she recognized who was standing there, her heart skipped a beat without warning. Luke stood in front of the classroom door, Stetson hat in hand, his face showing a bit of hesitation rarely seen in a Western man. He took a deep breath, as if gathering his courage, then said, "I have a favor to ask you." "If you don't mind." Eliza nodded slightly. "Please speak." I can't write as well as I used to. My hands shake, and my handwriting is so bad I can hardly read it myself. I've heard people in town say you're the best teacher around. If you'll let me, I'd like to take a little lesson again." Eliza was a little surprised. Western men rarely cared about literacy. They cared about good roads, good horses, good guns, and enough hay in the winter. A cowboy like Luke who asked to learn to write was a rare thing indeed. She looked at his hands. They were calloused from someone who had done heavy labor and held guns in situations where survival was difficult. The wound on his arm was still raw. She looked at him for a few seconds longer, realizing there was something fragile about his strength. "If you really want to learn, I'm willing to help," Eliza replied gently. Luke bowed his head slightly, a rare act of humility. "Thank you." The first lesson took place in the small classroom. All the children had gone home, leaving only the late sunlight shining on the long rows of desks. Luke sat at the front, his back straight, his hand holding the pen shaking slightly, but not trying to hide it. Eliza stood beside him. As she bent down to correct each stroke, her hand came close to his, sometimes accidentally brushing against his rough fingers. Neither of them spoke, but they both felt the strange silence in the room. Luke wrote an A, then a B. His strokes were strong, but uneven. He frowned and sighed slightly. "War takes away many things," he said softly. Eliza looked up at him. "Battlefield." Luke paused. "Yes, I served in the cavalry. Some nights my hands shook uncontrollably. It wasn't the same." Eliza said nothing. She just placed her hand on the paper where the C he had written was crooked. "It's okay for my hands to shake. The important thing is that I want to start over." Luke looked at her, long enough that Eliza felt a slow, deep current of emotion pass between them, a kind of unspoken respect, trust, and gratitude. There was something different about this teacher, he thought. She was strong yet gentle, calm yet not cold. Each of her words seemed to fall straight into his heart, not loudly, but touching places he thought were hardened. The lesson ended as the light outside the window faded. Eliza walked to the school gate, checking the lock, when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned around. Luke was standing there, his hands in his coat pockets, his breath billowing white smoke. "Thanks for the lesson. Not everyone has time for a lost cowboy." Eliza smiled faintly. He wasn't lost, just trying to find something he once had. Luke seemed to want to say something more, but then just nodded and walked away. Each step he took left deep footprints in the fresh snow, creating a straight line leading towards his temporary lodgings. Eliza stared at the figure for a long time. Something in her chest shifted slightly, as if an old door, once tightly closed for many years, had opened a tiny crack, just enough to let in a breeze. But the breeze was warm. That night, sitting in the wooden house where the pale yellow light of the oil lamp fell on the wall, Eliza opened the diary she rarely wrote in. Her hand held the pen slowly, as if afraid that the words she wrote would change something she was not ready to face. She wrote only 4 words. "A good stranger." And then she closed the diary. But her heart was not closed like before. Cotton Ridge was still quiet, still covered in snow, still familiar with the harsh life of the West. But from that night on, Eliza knew she had begun to see the world through different eyes. Not the eyes of a woman who had lost so much, but the eyes of someone unconsciously searching for a part of herself, the part she thought would never wake up again. Her life was still simple the next day, but deep down, she knew that her literacy lessons with Luke Maddox were just the beginning of something bigger, something she didn't dare name, and the more she feared to name it, the closer it seemed to come. In the sky above Cotton Ridge, the snow still fell, quietly and patiently, just like what was coming. To Eliza Carter's heart, the snow in Cotton Ridge still blanketed every roof, every tree, every dirt road that was usually dusty. But Eliza Carter found the snow no longer felt as empty as it had before. She walked through the path behind the school, her blue woolen cloak hugging her lean but sturdy frame. The western winter was lonely, but in the silence there was something new that warmed her heart more than she cared to admit. Teaching Luke Maddox to read became a regular part of the week. No one had a set schedule, but they both showed up when they were supposed to. The kids left. The air was quiet, and in the small space between the wooden walls, the only sound was pen on paper and the wind blowing outside the window. It was a strange time, not romantic, not exactly intimate, but a closeness Eliza hadn't shared with anyone in 10 years. Luke was the one who made the atmosphere different. Every time he entered the classroom, the air seemed thicker and warmer. He didn't talk much, but his eyes created dialogues that didn't need words to be exchanged. He always carried a steady silence, a silence of someone who had experienced things that couldn't be named, but still kept the ground under his feet. Once, as Eliza was sounding out each word for Luke to copy, she noticed he paused. Not because his hands were shaking, but because thoughts were welling up in his eyes? She asked softly, enough so as not to break the silence around them. What was bothering him? Luke looked down at the page. The writing was slightly slanted, less stiff than before, a sign of effort. But when he looked up again, the struggle within him was clear. Have you ever lost anyone? He asked. The question made Eliza stop breathing, not because it was rude, but because it was asked in the tone of someone who knew the feeling. Yes, she replied. He waited for her to continue, not pushing. My husband. Mine accident. Long ago. Luke nodded slightly, not with pity, but with understanding. The kind of understanding that only came from those who had faced death, who had known loss as a part of life. I lost several relatives in the war, Luke said, too quickly to comprehend what was happening. The feeling makes my hand shake when I hold the pen. Eliza didn't know what to say, but she placed her hand on the paper he was writing on, as lightly as touching the wind. Then she said one simple sentence. It was natural for his hands to shake. It was unnatural to try to bear it. Luke bowed his head slightly, as if receiving something no one had ever given him, a permission to be weak. Since arriving in Cotton Ridge, Eliza realized Luke had no place to call home. He rented a small room in a horse barn down the street, slept on a single wooden bed, and owned only an old backpack. He had no family here, no acquaintances, no one who knew him before the train derailment. The only things he carried were his chestnut-colored horse, his dusty boots, and his eyes filled with untold stories. One day, while Eliza was correcting his handwriting, her fingers accidentally brushed against his for a longer period than usual. The sensation surprised them both. Not the touch, but the way neither of them pulled back, as if it were the right thing to do at that moment. She realized that the most dangerous thing was not age, but the peace he brought, the peace that made her want to let go of all the barriers she had built over the years. But she still told herself to keep her distance, to protect her heart, to remember that he was only passing by. Luke seemed to sense her reticence. He never crossed the line she had not named. He just stood close, just looked at her with eyes that made one feel seen more clearly, more deeply. Occasionally, the townspeople would see Luke helping Eliza when her books got too heavy, or standing outside the school gates, adjusting the ropes that tied the doors so the wind wouldn't blow them away. They began to whisper that the young cowboy was interested in the widowed teacher. But Eliza didn't care. Still a little hesitant, but not as bothered as before. Maybe because what they said wasn't entirely wrong. Another day, as the snow began to pile up in thick sheets on the porch of the classroom, Luke brought Eliza a small gift. Nothing of value, just a freshly sharpened pencil, accompanied by a soft word from his lips. I see your pen is worn out. I could do this little thing. Eliza held the pen in her hand, her heart softening a little. Not because of the gift, but because of the way he looked at her, as if the little things in her life were worth caring about. She realized that for a long time, no one had noticed the fatigue in her hands as she wrote her notes. No one had asked if she was cold. No one had noticed the way her hair blew out around her neck when the wind blew. No one had entered her small world where everything she did was for the children and the simple life of Cotton Ridge. Luke did it, without trying to prove anything. Many evenings, Eliza would wrap up her scarf and walk out of the school gate, only to find Luke leaning against the fence, just to make sure she got home safely after her late teaching. He didn't say why, but the look in his eyes was enough for Eliza to understand. One day, as the snow fell softly on the main road, Luke walked beside her, not too close, not too far. He looked up at the white sky and said, "The snow in Wyoming is beautiful. So beautiful that it makes you forget you've been anywhere else." Eliza looked at him, understanding that he wasn't just talking about the snow. They stopped under the streetlights. Snowflakes fell on his Stetson, melting into droplets. Luke looked at her, not looking for an answer, just wanting to remember the moment. "Sometimes I feel like I've traveled too much," Luke said. "You know, there are moments when I want to stop and not think about tomorrow." Eliza was silent, but it wasn't an avoidance. She just didn't know what to say when her heart gave a beat so deep she had to stop herself from breathing too loudly. In class, the kids sometimes asked her about the new cowboy in town. They told her how he had helped mend fences, helped a family gather firewood when a strong wind had knocked it down. Cotton Ridge grew accustomed to Luke's presence, like an unquestioned part of the town. But Eliza was different. For her, Luke's presence was more than just a new person. It was a change in her heartbeat, a slight shift that made her familiar life create gaps to fill with emotion. The loneliness that had been dormant inside her was giving way to something warmer. One light, snowy afternoon. Luke stood in front of the classroom as Eliza finished teaching. He asked in a low, slightly embarrassed voice, "I want to ask you something. If it's okay with you." Eliza held the scarf around her neck, waiting for him to continue. "Would you mind having dinner with me? Just one. I want to thank you for helping me, and not just with my writing." Eliza's heart skipped a beat. The wind blew through the porch, stirring her hair against her cheek. In that moment, so many thoughts raced through her head. Age, the past, prejudice, the fear of loving again, and then the part she didn't want to admit she'd wanted this for a long time. She didn't answer right away, just looked at him for a long moment. A look long enough for Luke to understand that she was fighting with herself, not him. Finally, Eliza spoke in a very small but firm voice. "Okay, if that's what you want." Something lit up in Luke's eyes. Not hard, not frantic, just relief, like someone who has wandered for a long time and finally found a place to breathe. The snow continued to fall, blanketing Cotton Ridge Road in a blanket of white. No one in town knew that at that moment. A fragile thread of fate had been tied between two people who had suffered so much loss. That dinner was one neither of them would soon forget. There was no candlelight or fancy table, just Lucy Hargrove's little diner with the smell of baking bread and the warmth of the wood stove. Eliza and Luke sat across from each other, talking more than they ever had before, laughing more than they thought they could during that long winter. There was no rush, no overly intimate touching, no confession. But between them, something had quietly settled, like a breath finding a place to stop. So no one could have predicted that the incident would suddenly come a few days later, like a cold wind whipping into the face of someone standing outside the valley. That afternoon, Eliza was packing up her classroom when the sound of galloping horses came from down the street. As she stepped out the door, the first thing she saw were two men in heavy federal coats, riding black and gray horses. Their badges gleamed on their chests. Sheriff Amos Dwyer followed, his face heavy. The townspeople gathered, whispering. Eyes turned toward the warehouse where Luke rented a room. Their gazes were both curious and wary, as if they had heard bad news, but were not sure. Eliza suddenly felt cold in her chest. She wanted to go that way, but her feet felt like they were stuck in the snow. Sheriff Dwyer was the first to speak, his voice heavy with worry. "Luke Maddox, open the door. We need to talk to you." The warehouse door opened slightly. Luke walked out, his expression normal, but his eyes sharper than usual. He looked at the situation before him and asked in a low voice, "What's going on?" The federal agent stepped forward, his voice harsh. "You are suspected of involvement in the Red Hollow bank robbery half a year ago. You are under investigation. You must come with us." The murmurs grew louder. Some were surprised. Some nodded, as if they had known this all along. Small towns were prone to creating rumors. When someone's background was unknown, unsubstantiated stories could easily creep into people's minds. Eliza felt her stomach tighten at the sound of each word. No, it can't be. She wanted to step forward, wanted to say something, wanted to protect him, but her throat felt like it was being held tight, unable to make a sound. Luke looked around at the people around him, then back at Eliza. Just for a moment, but the look was enough to make her heart ache. There was no pleading or panic in his eyes, only something like deep sadness, mixed with a determination to accept what was happening. After a few formalities, the two federales moved to handcuff Luke. When the cold iron cuffs locked onto his wrists, the sound of metal was like a knife stabbing Eliza in the heart. Many of the townspeople watched the scene with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The rest backed away, not wanting to get involved in the mess. Luke turned to look at Eliza a second time. This time his gaze was so quiet she had to bite her lip to keep from calling his name in the crowd. "I didn't do it, Eliza," he said, loud enough for her to hear. "I did nothing wrong. A short sentence." But it made her take a step forward. "He's not like that," she replied, her breath hitching. They were making a mistake. A flash of emotion crossed Luke's eyes. Not hope, not relief, but gratitude. So much gratitude that it made one want to cry. But Miss Cotton Ridge could do nothing but watch as the two federal agents led him down the snow-covered road. As the horses disappeared down the street, a chill seeped through Eliza's cloak, reaching deep into her bones. She stood there, looking at the empty space they left behind, knowing one thing beyond all doubt. She believes him. She believes without reason, the way her heart knows its way. The town began to gossip within minutes of the group leaving. As Eliza walked through the small square, some people looked down to avoid her gaze. Some looked pitying. Some others seemed to think what they had said behind Luke's back was true. Eliza did not react. No one in town understood that ever since Luke was taken away. All her thoughts had revolved around one single sentence. He is innocent. She knew it, even though she had no proof. Even though no one believed it, she still believed it. Believed in his eyes when he wrote. Believed in the way he saved the child in the accident. Believed in the silence of someone who had suffered so much but had never harmed anyone. She returned home in a state of confusion. The oil lamp in the small wooden house flickered in the wind, its light reflecting off the wall in a shifting pattern. She sat at the table, opened the notebook she used for teaching, then paused. Her hand shook slightly as she put down the pen. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew she was about to step into something that did not suit her cautious nature. Eliza Carter prepares for battle. She started by finding Sheriff Dwyer. He greeted her with a look that was both grateful and worried. He had some faith in Luke, but by law, he couldn't interfere. Eliza questioned him about every detail, everything Luke had said about the past. She searched through everything she could remember about Roy Maddox, a name Luke had mentioned in passing during the previous lesson. Then she went to the town library and found old news reports about the Red Hollow bank robbery. The old papers were pale yellow. The text faded. But the more she read, the more vague she became. There were no witnesses to confirm Luke's presence. No description quite matched. There was only one piece of evidence, a detainee's testimony that mentioned the name Maddox. But Maddox is a common surname in many places. It cannot be assumed to be Luke. Eliza found Reverend Hayes. He helped her write a letter to Luke's old unit. It took days, but she kept going. Every night she jotted down little clues in a notebook. The sound of pen on paper became the only sound that kept her calm. Meanwhile, Luke was detained at a federal checkpoint more than 2 days from Cotton Ridge. There was no news about him other than word of mouth from a police officer. He didn't protest. He just said he didn't want any trouble. For Eliza, that only made her pity for him swell. A man so weary of life would have no strength left to defend himself. She was even more determined to change that. A week later, the letter from the cavalry unit arrived. When Eliza opened it, her hands shook in a different way, not with anxiety, but with hope. The letter confirmed that Roy Maddox, Luke's former comrade, had been involved in numerous scams and robberies after leaving the Army. He had also bragged to some soldiers that he had relatives with the same last name in the West. He used the last name Maddox as a way to deceive others. That means this coincidence could be entirely spurious. Eliza brought all the evidence to Sheriff Dwyer. He looked at the papers in her hand, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You want me to transfer it all to the feds?" Eliza nodded. "Yes, and I want to testify. I want to stand up and say what kind of person Luke Maddox was." Sheriff Dwyer did not answer immediately, but pulled out a chair for her and poured her a cup of hot coffee. He spoke very slowly. "Eliza, are you sure this is not a small matter? You will be talked about more in town." Eliza set down her coffee cup. Her voice was soft but firm. "I've been alone for too long. Sheriff, I'm not afraid of what people say anymore." He looked at her for a long time, then nodded. "I will help." What followed was a tense series of days. But thanks to Eliza's persistence, the evidence she gathered, and Sheriff Dwyer's testimony, the feds eventually admitted that Luke's arrest was based on insufficient evidence. Peter Langley, one of the 2 officers from the previous day, told the sheriff when he received the documents, "Someone else did the work for us. Perhaps we were in a hurry." When Luke was released, he asked only one question. "Who did all this?" The answer is a name. Eliza Carter. Hearing that, Luke was silent for a long time. A different kind of silence. Not a silence of repression, but the silence of someone who suddenly realized he was more valuable to someone than he had ever dared to think. News of Luke Maddox's release back to Cotton Ridge spread quickly, as if the normally chilly little town was always waiting for something to talk about. But for Eliza, the moment of seeing Luke back was not a complete relief. Her initial joy slowly melted into worry as she realized how different he looked. Luke returned to a clear day. The snow had stopped falling heavily. He stood in front of the school gates as Eliza was locking them up, looking tired, but not from the long journey. His eyes had a quiet darkness, the kind that only appears when one has seen things that make one's heart clench. "Just say one word. We have to talk." Eliza held her hand on the lock, unmoving. She had imagined the moment he was free many times, imagined all sorts of things he would say, what she would say, but never had she imagined his voice to be so hollow. They walked a few steps out of the schoolyard and stood beside the snow-covered wooden fence. The space was deserted, as if Cotton Ridge had held its breath at their conversation. Eliza spoke first. "I'm glad you're back. I was scared," Luke interrupted with a sigh. He held in, "Eliza, I don't know how to thank you, but there's something you need to understand." He looked straight at her, a gaze so genuine that it made the listener want to turn away to avoid being touched in the most fragile areas of themselves. "She has done so much for me, more than I deserve." Eliza frowned slightly. "Deserved, Luke. You're innocent. I only did the right thing." "No, she didn't just do the right thing. She stood up to the whole town for me." He took a deep breath as if to steady himself. "She shouldn't have done that. Not for me." The words fell on Eliza like a sudden fall of snow from the roof, cold and heavy. She asked, her voice cracking, "Why did he say that Luke turned away?" As if he was afraid that if he looked into her eyes too long, he would say something he shouldn't. "Because I dragged you into trouble. Because your life was fine before I came. You had a reputation, a job, everyone's respect. And I was just a wanderer with nothing certain in my hands." Eliza felt a slight pain spread in her chest. Not because of what he said, but because she knew he truly believed it. Luke continued speaking, his voice so low that even the wind almost carried it away. "Eliza, I don't want to be the one to make you the subject of gossip. I don't want you to have to bear any more burdens from me." Eliza bit her lip to keep her composure. She looked at the man standing before her, his weathered face, his eyes that had seen death, pain, betrayal, and a week of inexplicable detention. The man was trying to push her away, not because he lacked affection, but because he loved her too much. But that love made her feel left alone on a land lonelier than the snow outside. She asked very softly, "Do you think I'm that weak?" Luke stepped back slightly, surprised. I just don't want you to suffer because of me," Eliza continued, her voice clearer this time. "You are not a burden. Don't ever think so. I've lived long enough to know what is a burden and what is worth keeping. You are not a burden. Luke?" He shook his head, like someone trying to untie a knot that only tightens. "Eliza, you don't understand. In war, you get used to losing things. I lost my friends, my faith, my ability to believe I was worth staying anywhere. I think maybe I shouldn't be around you anymore. I don't want you to pay for something I haven't fixed." A silence fell between them, a long, heavy silence, punctuated by the wind blowing through the wooden roofs. Eliza felt his every word, his every breath, and understood that this was not a refusal. This was the confession of a man drowning in self-reproach. She stood straight, her eyes never leaving him. "You're avoiding him. Luke?" He did not respond immediately, but in the long silence, Eliza saw his shoulders tremble slightly. She stepped closer. "I lost someone I loved once. I was in that void for 10 years, and I learned that love doesn't come around very often. When it comes again, I don't want to miss it." Luke closed his eyes for a moment, as if he wanted to find the words to retort but couldn't find any. His heart was at war with the fragments of his past that he had always kept hidden in the dark. Eliza continued, slowly, "If you want to go, I won't stop you. But don't say I need to be protected from you. The only thing I need to be protected from is being alone." That sentence made Luke open his eyes. There was pain, warmth, and a flutter in his eyes that he had tried to hide since he first met her. He turned away. "I needed time." Eliza nodded. "I need time, too." Neither of them said anything more. Luke stepped back, touching his hat in farewell. Eliza watched him walk down the snow-covered road. He never looked back. She didn't call his name either. Not because she was angry, but because she understood that there were battles in everyone's heart that no one else could fight for them. The next few days passed in silence. Luke didn't go to school. He didn't wait by the fence. He didn't stop by Lucy's in the evenings for hot coffee like he always did. People in town began to say he was planning to leave Cotton Ridge again. Eliza heard it from the children, from the passers-by, from the whispers as she walked through the market. But she did not ask anyone, nor did she seek news. She just quietly let her heart speak for itself, feel it, endure it. In the small wooden house, she often sat in front of the window looking out at the white yard. Every time she heard the sound of horse hooves in the distance, her heart tightened slightly, then relaxed when she realized it was not him. She understood that this was the stage where people had to let their memories sharpen themselves. One evening, Eliza reopened her diary. The old pages were slightly bent by the cold. She wrote slowly, each word as if holding her breath. If you truly love someone, let them fight their darkness. No matter the outcome, light will come from it. She closed the book. She didn't cry, but her eyes carried the beautiful sadness of someone who loved with all her broken heart. Meanwhile, Luke was in the small room at the end of town, wrestling with thoughts deeper than his battle wounds. He stood by the oil lamp, looking at his hands that had shaken in the war, remembering the way Eliza had placed them, remembering the look in her eyes when she had said she didn't need protection from him, remembering how she had fought against the entire town to clear his name. No one had ever believed in him like that. That belief made him feel bigger, but at the same time smaller in front of the goodness he thought he didn't deserve. Luke looked out the window. The sky over Cotton Ridge was black, punctuated by a few stars. He saw Eliza in every breath of wind, every streak of light, every silence. He said softly to himself, "I don't want to run anymore." The words echoed in the room like a promise. Not a promise to Eliza, but a promise to himself. That morning, Luke Maddox prepared to return to the only place he wanted to be. Not to apologize, not to justify, but to stand before the woman who saw the real him, and to say the things I dare not say. In the days after Luke's silent departure, Cotton Ridge seemed to take on a nameless gray. Eliza walked into the classroom, grading papers and correcting children's notebooks, but her heart felt suspended. Every knock on the door, every distant hoofbeat would startle her. Her life was steady, but inside there was an emptiness of someone waiting for something uncertain. The snow melted away, revealing patches of mud on the ground. The dry branches of the trees beside the school fence formed slender curves, like fingers stretched out in the wind, both weak and determined. The air was cooler, but Eliza's heart still carried a chill of anticipation. One afternoon, as Eliza was packing up her books, she suddenly heard the sound of a horse stopping right in front of the gate. The sound of hooves was slow, steady, and even, like the heartbeat of someone who had made an important decision. Eliza froze, her hand stopping on the half-opened page of her book. A gentle breeze blew through the crack in the door, making the light flicker, making her feel like time had stopped in that moment. She stepped out the door. Luke Maddox was standing in the yard, covered in wet mud and a thin layer of snow. He was hatless, his hair wind-ruffled, his face hardened by something he had been thinking about for too long. But his eyes, when they met hers, were no longer the heavy darkness they had been the previous days. There was only the bottomless calm of a man who had just won a battle with himself. Eliza kept her hand on the door. The two stood facing each other, neither of them speaking immediately. The silence wasn't awkward or distant. It was like the calm after a storm. Luke raised his voice. "Eliza, I wanted to say the things I hadn't been able to say." She didn't invite him in, didn't turn away. She just stood there, as if where she stood was the limit he had to cross with his own sincerity. "Go on." "Luke," he swallowed lightly, not avoiding it. "I was scared, not of being caught, nor of being misunderstood. What scared me was the feeling that I didn't deserve what she gave me." She kept her eyes fixed on him. Did he look away because he thought he wasn't good enough? Luke nodded, but I realized something important. She saw me beneath the dust, beneath the confusion of the past. She saw me in a way no one had ever seen me before, and I was stupid enough to think I had to leave to protect her. His voice trembled slightly, but not from weakness. It was the courage of someone forcing himself to say what was most pressing. "I don't want to run anymore." Eliza. A simple sentence, but it made Eliza feel like a huge space opened up in her heart, where warmth could enter. She slowly took a step towards him. "You think I need someone perfect to lean on. I need someone real. Someone who is brave enough to tell me their fears. Someone who will turn back when they go too far." Luke lowered his eyes, as if receiving a greater gift than he expected. He spoke softly. "I want to stay at Cotton Ridge. If you'll let me. I want to build something here. Not because I need a place to stay, but because you're here." Hearing those words, Eliza's heart skipped a beat. It was different from the confusion she felt when she first met him. This was a touch to the deepest part of her heart, a place she had believed would remain closed forever after her ex-husband's death. She asked, very gently, "So what do you want me to do?" Luke took another step. "Eliza, I want to be close to you, but this time, I'll go slow. Enough to let you see I'm really here. Not leaving. Not lying. Not running away." They were so close that the slightest movement would have been enough to touch. But Luke took his time. He stood still, as if to let her know he respected any distance she placed. Eliza took a deep breath. I was afraid he wouldn't come back. Luke looked her straight in the eyes. I was afraid to turn back, too. But then I remembered what she had said. He paused. He was not a burden. That had kept me at Cotton Ridge more than anything else. A thin layer of mist covered Eliza's eyes, as if her long-standing loneliness was slowly melting away. She didn't need a sudden confession, nor did she need grand oaths. What she needed was the truth from the person in front of her. She spoke slowly. I don't fall in love easily, but when I do, I don't leave anyone. Luke smiled, a rare smile that softened his usually calm face. I knew, and that was what made me want to be worthy of her. Those words rang in the air like a milestone. Not dramatic, not overly passionate, but strong enough to open a door that both of them were afraid to touch. Eliza took another half step, her chest lifted by a sense of peace. If you really want it, let me see it by being here. Not for me to lean on, but so we can stand side by side. Luke looked at her as if he was taking in every word. I promise. He raised his hand, not touching her right away, but leaving it open, giving her the chance to make the final decision. Eliza looked at that hand for a long time. Hands that had shaken in war. Hands that had been handcuffed because of a misunderstanding. Hands that had held a pen and written under her guidance. Hands that had been bandaged by her. She placed her hand in his. Not hard, not hesitant. Just a movement as natural as breathing. His fingers closed, lightly as if holding something precious that he swore he would never lose again. In that moment, Cotton Ridge stood still. The wind blew through the old-school roof. Snow fell from the trees in thin streaks. Light from the classroom windows fell on the two people, creating a picture of emptiness but full of hope. Eliza spoke softly, like a confession she had kept to herself for a long time. I've been lonely enough. Luke, we're all lonely enough, he replied in a low but warm voice. No more words were needed. The silence between them was no longer distance but sharing. A healing silence. When Eliza let go of his hand to lock the classroom door, Luke waited outside, not rushing, not pushing, just standing there, as if to confirm that this time he wouldn't disappear again. They walked toward the street leading to Cotton Ridge Square, where the lights from Lucy's were a soft yellow. For the first time in years, Eliza's footsteps were less heavy, and Luke no longer looked lost, like someone just passing through town. They walked side by side, not close, but close enough to know they were both heading in the same direction. Cotton Ridge enters the season of melting snow and change. The air smells of damp earth, as if the small town is breathing again after a long winter. New shoots sprout along the school fence. Sparrows return to roost on rooftops, and a soft light covers the valley. In that flourishing, Eliza felt a change in the rhythm of her life. Not because everything around her had changed, but because Luke Maddox's presence had become as much a part of her as the warmth of the wood stove in the cabin. He didn't make a fuss or show off. He came in silence, in small gestures, by standing close enough to let her know she wasn't alone. Luke spent a lot of time mending the fence around the school. He didn't say why, only that the loose boards were dangerous for the children. Eliza knew he might want to do something for her, even if it was just a small thing. She also didn't mention that he often stood outside the school gates when she finished teaching. He didn't ask. She didn't tell. But understanding settled over them both like a pleasant mist. One day, while Eliza was stacking her books, Luke walked into the classroom, looking puzzled. I got some food from Mrs. Hargrove's, he said, clutching a bag of hot muffins. I think maybe you haven't eaten yet. Eliza looked at the bag of cookies, her heart slowing down to a familiar rhythm. Since her husband passed away, no one paid attention to the little things in her life. No one bought her cookies. No one asked if she had eaten. No one cared if she was tired or cold. Luke didn't need to say much, but his actions brought a warmth that was enough to soothe the dark corners she had hidden for many years. He set the bag of cookies on the table, standing awkwardly, like someone who doesn't know if he's overreacting. Eliza smiled, the effortless smile that comes when one's heart is full of gratitude. Luke, thank you. I like how you care without making a big deal out of it. He bowed his head slightly, his eyes shining with relief. I just wanted to do something. For her. His voice was low, but sincere. So sincere that Eliza had to turn away to hide the emotions that were rising too quickly. Over the next few days, the town began to notice the two of them hanging out together. No one said anything. But the looks exchanged between the market ladies and the whispers outside Lucy's were enough to let Eliza know that someone was disapproving. Some older men told her outright that Eliza was being drawn to the young cowboy. Some women told her that she was doing something wrong because of the age difference. The words came like little knives, not enough to knock her down, but enough to leave a few dull cuts. One afternoon, when Mrs. Wilson hinted that older women should keep to themselves, Eliza stood still, not interrupting, but her hands clenched in her coat. She did not react or argue back. But that night, sitting by the small wooden table, watching the oil lamp sway in the wind, she knew that there was still a weak part of her that wanted to withdraw. The fear of being judged, of being misunderstood, of being hurt again still smoldered. But when she closed her eyes, the only image that appeared was Luke standing under the school porch, his face softened in the light. That moment soothed the voices outside. Eliza knew something inside her was changing. Not everyone comes into our lives to take away our peace. Some come to bring back the warmth we have lost for so long. A few days later, when Luke came to fix the stuck classroom door, Eliza decided to say what she had kept in mind. People started talking about us. He stopped and looked up at her. His eyes were not surprised, as if he had heard it long ago. Was she sad because of that? Eliza looked down, her fingers brushing the edge of the table. Not exactly sad. It's just, it took me years to find my footing again. I was afraid that if things went too far, I would lose the peace I had found. Luke put down the hammer. He came close, but didn't touch her. If you feel uncomfortable, I'll keep my distance. The words were soft, but they startled Eliza. No, that wasn't it. Luke waited for her to continue. Eliza looked him straight in the eye, speaking in a voice that held her heart. I don't want you to back away. I just need you to know I have a past that scares me. What other people say is less important than what you think of me. Luke let out a small breath, as if a weight had been lifted. I think you are the strongest woman I have ever met, and I want to walk with you through everything, whether it be rumors or fears. Eliza's eyes softened to the point where her gaze could melt the remaining snow on the roof after hearing this. I don't want to lose you. Luke, it was the first time she had said it out loud. Not hastily, but with the maturity of someone who had known deep loss. Luke was silent, then moved a little closer. He reached out and touched her elbow very lightly, enough to say he was there, enough not to make her flinch. Eliza, he said slowly, I'm not going anywhere. Not. When I come back to this town, I know I've made my choice. At that moment, Eliza felt her heart open up to a space she had never had before. She realized that what she feared most was not age or gossip. What she feared most was thinking that love was no longer meant for her. And now, hearing him say that fear receded like mist blown away by the sun. The gossip in town died down in the days that followed. Perhaps it was because people had grown accustomed to seeing Luke standing next to Eliza. Perhaps the weight of the criticism was nothing compared to the peace they exuded whenever they were together. When Luke walked beside her, his gaze seemed to place her in the most important position. One afternoon, as the light dyed the old schoolhouse a golden yellow, Luke invited Eliza for a walk out onto the field outside town, overlooking the wide valley. They sat on a large rock, the breeze carrying the scent of newly sprouted grass. The silence surrounded them, but it was not heavy. Luke spoke first. Eliza, I never thought I would find a place to stay, but now I think differently. She turned to look at him, the afternoon light shining on his face, highlighting his strong yet gentle features. I've been wandering for too long, Luke continued. Since losing my family, I've lost the belief that this world has a place for me. Until I met you. Eliza fell silent for a moment. Her heart suddenly felt strangely fragile. He continued, his voice a little lower. Eliza, I know I'm younger than you. I know that makes you nervous. But I don't care. All I want is to stand by you and give you the best of me. She felt the sincerity in every word he spoke. She didn't need to think any further. Her heart had already answered. Luke, she said softly, it's not age that scares me. What I fear is not being loved properly. And you've shown me what I thought I would never get again. A gentle wind blew, carrying the cold of the mountains, but also making this moment pure. Luke looked at her for a long time, like someone who had found shelter after years of standing in the storm. He asked in a deep voice, Eliza, can I hold your hand? The question, as simple as a breath, moved Eliza more than any flowery confession. She reached out to him without hesitation. Luke's hand closed gently, firmly, but respectfully. A feeling of peace spread through her, as if her dry soul had been watered. That moment seemed to mark a transformation in both of them. No more fighting or hesitation, just trust. Eliza knew she had entered a new phase of her life. No more years of seclusion, no more workaday routine, and no more empty nights. Luke had entered her life with a quiet sincerity, a gaze as deep as the sea, and the patience of someone who knew what was worth waiting for. She turned to him, her voice soft but firm. "Luke, I'm starting to believe that sometimes you have to go through loss to find the right person for you." He squeezed her hand gently, his voice blending with the wind. "Maybe we were on the right path to meet each other." They sat still on the rock, hand in hand. No need to say anything more. No need to rush. Their hearts had found a way to open. And Cotton Ridge, with the changes of the new season, witnessed that moment as a rebirth for two people who thought their lives had long ended. Cotton Ridge begins to green up. The frozen ground comes alive with a whisper of new season. The sky is bigger, the blue is deeper, and the wind carries a gentle warmth that soothes the soul. Eliza felt the change in the air, as if she herself were reblooming from her old roots. These days, she taught with a different spirit than before. The chalk strokes on the blackboard were softer. The stories she told to the children were filled with warmth. Even the sparrows seemed to be hopping closer to the classroom door, as if they wanted to share something with her. The change didn't come from magic. It came from the persistent presence of Luke Maddox. He had not lost his usual calmness, but that calmness was no longer the color of darkness. It was like a still lake, reflecting even the unspeakable. In his eyes, when he looked at Eliza, there was no longer any struggle or hesitation. There was only the certainty of someone who had already chosen his path. One afternoon, as Eliza and Luke walked along the path leading to the prairie, the wind carried the scent of fresh grass, while making them both slow down. The sky opened up as if embracing the valley, and the earth below stretched out in soft green strips. Eliza stopped by a large rock where they had sat and talked. She asked softly, half jokingly, "Where would you go without me?" Luke didn't answer right away. He bent down and picked up a rock, turning it gently in his hand, as if weighing something. "I don't know, but I do know I'll keep wandering. Maybe through Montana, maybe down to Texas. But wherever I go, I won't find what I found here." He looked up, and in the moment their eyes met. Eliza knew what he meant was more than emotion. It was the truth of a soul so torn by the wind that it could hardly believe there was a place to rest. Eliza asked again, "What did you find?" Luke stepped closer. "A reason to believe that I still had good in me?" The answer made Eliza's chest tighten with emotion. All her life, she had thought that she only knew how to teach children to read and write, to teach them good and right things. But she never thought that her gentleness could save anyone but her own heart. They sat back on the rock. In the distance, Reverend Hayes' horses ran through the valley, drawing vivid curves on the ground. In that sight, Eliza saw something she had never dared to admit she wanted Luke to be a part of her life, longer than the days on Cotton Ridge, longer than the hours of literacy in the old wooden schoolhouse. Luke didn't hide his feelings either. He looked out at the valley, then back at her. "Eliza, I want to build something lasting. Not a house. A life. I don't know if I can give you what you deserve, but I want to try. I want to stand by you, longer than I ever dared to imagine." Eliza fell silent, her heart pounding softly but strongly. "You don't need to give me anything. Just be honest. And here—" Luke smiled, a rare smile that made his face look almost youthful. But just as they were about to fall into that peace, the sound of horse hooves from the main road grew louder, breaking the peaceful moment. A horseman came galloping up, his face full of urgency. It was Paul Hargrove, the son of the innkeeper Lucy. He stopped before Luke and Eliza, his voice hoarse. A big storm was coming up the mountain. Reverend Hayes said his horses had strayed into the East Valley. If they weren't rounded up, they might slide off the cliff. Eliza turned to Luke, concern evident. Was he strong enough? Luke squeezed her shoulder, his eyes reassuring. "I've been through bigger storms than this." "Don't worry." He mounted his horse instinctively, then looked back at Eliza for a long moment. At that moment, no one spoke. But they both understood the test came at the moment their hearts had just opened. Eliza watched Luke ride toward the eastern valley with Paul. The sky above the mountain tops began to darken, streaks of dark clouds rolling in as if foreboding something ominous. A strong wind whipped down, shaking the branches of nearby trees. Eliza stood still, anxious, not because of the storm, but because for the first time in years, she had something to lose. The storm came suddenly. Rain poured down on western Wyoming, like someone had ripped a bag of water out of the sky. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the valley for a split second. Winds blew so hard they tossed dry branches and slammed into the schoolhouse roof. Eliza refused to stay home in the storm. She wrapped herself in her cloak and felt hat and walked out into the street, the rain beating against her face. She headed for the path leading to the valley. The single street lamp swayed in the strong wind, its small light enough to illuminate the fear in the heart of a woman who had known loss too often. She stood under the eaves of the stable, staring into the darkness where Luke had gone. Her heart pounded with each crack of thunder, as sharp as time itself. With each passing minute, her anxiety grew. But she did not budge. She waited, steadfast as a poplar against the wind on a hilltop. Then, through the roar of the storm, a horse's hooves sounded, faint at first in the thick rain, then growing clearer. Eliza held her breath. Out of the rain, the silhouette of a rider emerged. His cloak was soaked. His shoulders drooped with fatigue, but he still held the reins tightly. Luke Maddox returns. Eliza stepped off the porch as he stopped his horse before her. Rain soaked into her clothes, but she no longer felt cold. All she saw was his eyes, wet with rain but bright with life. She asked, her voice choked, "Are you okay?" Luke dismounted and touched her hand gently. "I'm fine, just a little scratched. The horses are safe, but I was thinking, if I don't come back, if I don't see you." He paused, his breath caught in the emotion. I knew there was no place for fear in me anymore. I wanted to live, not just from day to day, but to be with her. Eliza stood before him, rain running down her cheeks like tears. She was not crying. The storm was crying for the things she could not say. She touched his face, lightly, as if he might vanish if she pressed any harder. "Luke, since you walked into Cotton Ridge, you brought something I thought I had lost forever. You brought hope, no fuss, no rush, just as light as the first breeze of the season." Luke held her hand, his heart beating hard enough for her to feel through his palm. "Eliza, I love you. No need for the solemnity of a wedding hall. No need for flowers or music. In the midst of the storm, in the still ragged breath of someone who had just returned from the edge of danger, that confession rang out so sincerely that it made heaven and earth stand still." Eliza replied in a voice that did not tremble, for her heart had chosen, "I love you too, Luke." The two stood in the middle of a storm, not caring about the rain falling on his hair, his clothes, his wounds that had not yet dried. They hugged each other, not too tightly, but enough to dispel all the darkness of the past. The storm gradually receded, as if it had only come to test them. Cotton Ridge brightened. The wet ground reflected the morning light. The clouds parted, leaving the sky clear. A few weeks later, the small town saw something unprecedented. Not a noisy wedding, not a big party, but the image of Eliza and Luke walking side by side down the main street like they belonged to each other all along. No one talked anymore. People saw the compatibility in every step, every look. They saw that love did not bloom late. It only bloomed at the right time. Their story spreads as a gentle reminder. Age does not prevent the heart from finding the warmth it needs. Sometimes one must suffer deeply and be lonely for a long time to appreciate what comes. Eliza finds joy in each lesson, knowing that when she locks the classroom door, Luke is waiting for her in the yard. Luke finds a reason to stay in town and build a life he once believed he didn't deserve. Both of them became proof that gentleness can save, understanding can heal, and sometimes the greatest thing people can do is to reach out to each other with the truth of their hearts. Cotton Ridge, their once lonely place, now became the starting point of a new life. Quiet, unhurried, but sustainable. A late-blooming season. So beautiful that it makes people believe that love is never a story of age, but a story of the heart, finding a home. The story of Eliza and Luke reminds us of a simple thing that many people have to go through most of their lives to realize the heart never ages. What makes people tired is not age, but unheard wounds and missed opportunities for love. At the age of 60, 70 or more, we still have the right to find warmth again, the right to trust, the right to start something new if it brings peace to the soul. Love is not measured by years, but by harmony, understanding, and the courage to choose each other in moments that seem too late. And sometimes, the quiet serenity of old age is a beautiful force. It helps us see clearly what is truly worth holding on to. Thank you for taking the time to read this story. If you feel touched, please like, share, and subscribe so we can bring you more healing stories. May you always find the peace your heart deserves.